Good afternoon. This is Michael speaking. I'm sitting here in Geneva in our small meeting room together with Christian, and we will guide you through a webinar about the PEFC revised Sustainable Forest Management Standard and the PEFC Group certification requirements. Just to double check at the beginning, it's great that you didn't unmute yourself. And I appreciate if you keep that during the webinar, except when you are asking questions, of course. But just to make sure that you can all hear me, I would be happy if one or several participants would just give me a sign and say, yes, we can hear you in Geneva.
Okay. Yes.
So obviously a few people can hear us. Thank you very much for this feedback. So welcome to our webinar. We are going to introduce new elements in the final drafts of both standards, the PEFC SFM benchmark as well as the group certification standard, with as a kind of preparation of the PEFC week in 2 weeks from today. I just start with a brief overview about the final steps in the standard revision process, about the further steps, so to make sure that we are all on the same page concerning the revision process. So just a few weeks ago, in the end, concerning the webinar, a few housekeeping issues, organizational issues. We do record this webinar, so just in case that you raise your voice, please be aware that it's recorded, but it's for PEFC internal purposes only. Internal purposes means we will provide either the full recording or at least a link on Podio to all the other members so that they can listen, that they can see the webinar if they want to see that as well. Please be aware of that data protection and all regulations in your particular countries. We are recording this webinar. Time-wise, I actually hardly dare to say how long it will take. It depends of your questions. We are a group currently of 14 participants, so we would like to give you the chance to ask questions, to discuss items if necessary, to discuss specific elements of the standard. I assume that the SFM standard will need maybe about an hour and about 30 minutes for the group certification standard. So the purpose, or why are we doing that in context of the revision process, you see on the screen, it's not that long ago that the working group agreed on a consensus on the final draft. This 27th July is the consensus date for the Sustainable Forest Management requirements. The group certification, I didn't list the group certification date. It was a little bit later, at some point in September, in a conference call. So the next step was the 5th of October. The PEFC Board of Directors agreed to recommend the approval of the standard. So they reviewed all the related documentation, development report, the standard itself. They got some information again about the revision process. So they decided to recommend the approval. So today and tomorrow we have 2 webinars to inform our members, and it's for members only. So we didn't make it publicly available, the access and the announcement. It's about to highlight the major changes in the 2 standards. The changes actually to prepare the PEFC week. In the PEFC week, we have on the Tuesday in the members only session, I guess a 2-hour session again for the standards, and it will be very similar to what we are doing today. We decided to offer these additional webinar days just to be able to prepare maybe some additional information, or if we get specific questions today, for example, that we cannot answer immediately, we still have the answer. We still have the chance to answer those questions on the Tuesday, still a day before the vote, because on the Wednesday, so actually today in 2 weeks, the GA has to vote on the documents on the group certification standard and the sustainable forest management standard. The vote, or this further process, just to make sure that you are aware of that, the decision, the General Assembly decision, will actually be a very simple one. You have the chance for either yes or no. You don't have the chance to say yes, but we want to see this change or that change, or we want to delete a specific requirement, we want to add something. That's not possible anymore in this vote at the General Assembly. The only way to change something would be that the vote is negative and the board is giving the document back to the particular working group, and the working group has to find a solution for the specific challenges. So that's again one of the reasons why we do the webinar today and tomorrow for another group, a smaller group, depending on the time zones, so that hopefully everybody is aware and has the answers of all questions that our members potentially have on the two standards. So that's the overview, the objective. That's what I already mentioned at the end, to set the scene for the voting at the General Assembly. So please feel free to interrupt my presentation if you have any questions, or we will have a discussion. We will have the chance to respond to your questions after my presentation. I will stop after the Sustainable Forest Management Standard and give you the chance to discuss, to ask, and the same after the Group Certification Standard at the end of the webinar. So far, the objectives.
Michael, there is Gerhard from PEFC.
To you to ask at that stage if you have any questions or any comment. There was.
I have a question, Michael.
Yeah.
Michael, is it possible that there will be a document where all the changes from the old standard to the are put it together in such a document, or is that not possible?
We have such a document for the SFM standard. I will use that today during the presentation, or it will be actually the main part of the presentation. We will provide those documents after the webinar by email to you so that you get it. We don't have a similar document for the group certification standard at the moment, and since there were some significant changes, I'm still not sure whether it makes sense, but maybe we still have to spend some thoughts on that, whether we prepare the document for the SFM standard is very detailed. It's actually a table with 2 columns. In the left column, the today's requirement, or the requirements in the new version, and in the right column, the requirements of the old standard, so that you can go, if you want to do that, to the individual word and check where the differences are. And it's good that,
because my new chairman said,
since I will not be able to mention each single word that was touched in the revision. So if you want to go to that detail, you can use this document. You want
okay, because my new chairman wanted to know the changes from the old standard to the new standard. And because he's new, and for him such differences between these two standards would be necessary to interpret the changes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You will see the document in a few.
Thank you, Michael.
We provide it afterwards. So any other
Okay.
general question at that point? No. Then I go to the content. We do it actually for both standards in the same way. I start with a few basics and then going to the details. In the SFM standard, I would like to highlight first a few basic things which are still the same. So to make clear that the basic structural elements, a few basic structural elements didn't change in the revision process. So the benchmark still consists of a main body and appendices. The 2010 version, you know that it's the main body plus an appendix for plantations, for interpretations of the main body for plantations. Now in the 2018 version, we have additionally an appendix for the trees outside forest interpretations. The use of the standard is still the same. That means the main body is mandatory. The appendices can be used for those who want to use it. That means if you want to have a plantation standard in your country, you can develop a plantation standard, or you can integrate the plantation requirements in the main body of the standard. And that's actually the same now for the plantations and the TOF standard. So theoretically, a country can have 1, 2, or 3 standards. It's still the same like in the previous years, that the requirements can be implemented on the individual level, or if countries are using group certification on the group level. Implicitly, that was done by a few countries since years. In this revision now, we formalized this approach, and it's specifically addressed in the group certification standard. Requirements not relevant for a particular country or geographical area of the standard can be left out. So a simple example for that is non-wood forest products. In a few countries, they don't play any role, so they are not mentioned in the standard, and that's still the same. And also the requirements covered by law not necessarily need to be repeated in the standard. You know, that's a traditional element of PEFC. However, I clearly say that I do not really like that, since it can create, in worst case, some intransparency that is not that desirable. At least we have an additional requirement in the new version that those elements need to be made transparent. So these are the basic things which are still the same like in the existing standard. So on a very general level, what's new in the SFM standard? I guess everybody who has seen the standard recognized that the structure is very different. The working group decided to use the so-called ISO high-level structure for management system standard. That's a standard structure that ISO established a few years ago for all standards which want to be recognized under ISO, or which want to become an ISO standard as a management system standard. So of course, PEFC is not an ISO standard, and it does not look like we will become an ISO standard, but we have close links to ISO. We have strong links to the accreditation arena being responsible for ISO standards. So it makes PEFC's life, or the life in a few countries, much easier if we use a structure that is familiar for our accreditation bodies and that is familiar for certification bodies. So that's one of the reasons why the working group decided to do that. So to make this accreditation life, to make our accreditation life easier. Another reason is that we got the feedback from a few countries that are already using this structure, that they have very good experience with larger companies applying different standards in the company. and so having the similar structure of the standard in the country. What PEFC currently does not request, and it's not planned to request, to make this structure mandatory. So the national governing bodies can still use their structure, the structure of the standard that in some countries might be very different for historical reasons, in some countries for specific purposes. It's not mandatory to go to this structure. It's just mandatory to implement the requirements which are covered behind this structure, but not taking over the structure. The structure actually represents a typical management cycle in the particular chapters of the standard. So this plan do check act as a management system approach how to structure sustainable forest management. I guess you know that as well, that the majority of our countries since lots of years are based on management system structure and management system accreditation, and only a few countries still have been using in the last years, in the recent year, in the last years, a product certification approach. And now with this new structure, PEFC clearly shows that we want to be perceived as a management system approach. The structure, maybe some of you know that, or you have seen that in the standard. You can see the 10 headlines of the first level. And if you would now take ISO management system standard, for example, the quality management system standard, on the highest level, you could exactly see those 10 headlines. Talking about PEFC in group certification context, in the group certification standard, we do have exactly the same 10 headlines like here in the SFM standard. So that's the first major change, mainly relevant for the structure, not that much for the content. Content-wise, for language issues and a few specific issues which I will address later. The language of the standard changed. So it's now a language that clearly indicates the benchmark character of the standard, so that each requirement starts, or the requirement starts with this standard requires. That something specifically happens. So saying from a perspective of an assessor or somebody who's benchmarking a national standard, this person is checking whether the national or regional standard requires a specific element. So that's the background of this language change. Ecosystem services are a little bit strengthened. You see that in a few chapters. For example, in 8.5, you can see that that was a big discussion in the working group, or there were some discussions in the working group, how to deal with this ecosystem service development. And there is a kind of forecast or assumption that in future, maybe forest management standards will be more and more structured according to specific systematics describing different ecosystem services. So in the 2018, in the potential 2018 version, it's not done that strongly, but in a few places you can find that ecosystem services are highlighted. And of course, one of the main changes is this Appendix 2, or not a change, but an amendment, the amendment of the trees outside forest appendix. So with a very simple example here, you see different production systems, different systems, how trees outside forests can look like. And the TOF appendix allows to bring such production systems under certification and integrate the timber in a PEFC supply chain. Do you have any questions to those on this general level before I go to the details? I don't hear anything, so I go into the details. A simple list before I jump to the standard. You see this as an overview what we changed. So I don't touch everything now on this slide. Human rights, for example, following the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights, is one of the new elements. It was not covered in the previous standard. I say that quite frankly, that will give us in a few countries presumably some headache. At the moment, there is no guidance from our perspective, from PEFC International or from PEFC Council, how to implement that in forestry context. There's lots of literature out there and lots of guidance documents, and it will affect a few countries stronger. A few countries will actually not be affected since it's not an issue. The minimum standards for forest works wages, an interesting discussion point. That's a requirement specifically driven by the BWI representative in the working group. So coming to a consensus, coming to a kind of compromise in the requirement. We had very different versions around these workers' wages requirements. So actually we found a compromise where BWI clearly said, yes, we support PEFC with this standard. Climate positive practices, gender equality promoted as an important element, working conditions monitored, and this chapter 9, of course, from an overall perspective, this performance evaluation as an additional element. So that's the rough overview. I will now jump into more details if you don't interrupt me with a question. And now you see on the screen the document that I mentioned a few minutes ago. You will get this overview table in this column. So you actually see the final draft requirement for the revised standard. In this column, you see the requirements of the existing 2010 version. There are two different highlights in the document. This yellow area where we say this might be specifically interesting for national governing bodies, and the bold highlighted text that is actually new in general. So the yellow highlighted stuff from our perspective, not saying that it is the case, but these are the parts where we said from our perspective it could be, those yellow areas could be the most relevant elements for our NGBs, for our members. So now I will go through the document, not addressing everything. So even I ask for your understanding, if I don't touch all the yellow stuff, you will get the document, and that should allow you to be prepared for the PEFC week, just in case that you want to go to that detail. Just a few words about the introduction. It is much longer than in the existing version simply for communication reasons. The working group came to the conclusion that this standard, the document, is more and more used by different stakeholders with very different knowledge levels about PEFC. So if a big international retailer, for example, is using the standard, they don't read lots of literature about PEFC and not that many details. So it was decided to include a little bit a longer introduction to describe the PEFC system in general for those stakeholders who just take this standard as document to understand what's going on. So the scope, I mentioned it, changed with the TUF amendment. Stakeholder, important stuff, important part is concerning stakeholder definition that we harmonize now in all PEFC standards the definition of the stakeholder. So in the group certification and especially in the standard setting requirement, we are talking about the stakeholder groups with the same definition. So that's actually a harmonization issue. Afforestation and reforestation later, that was a discussion in the working group whether it's necessary to define that. The term was used since 1999 in PEFC standards. They both terms were not defined yet, and in context with a few changes with the TUF, with the changing of the forest definition, the working group was of the opinion to use the definition to include the FAO definition for those terms. Certified area is important. It's and you will see the same definition in a specific context in the group certification standard. Certified area, and that's now for the very technical people listening. And it's a challenge in the accreditation arena when we are talking as a management system standard. Under management system accreditation and management system standards, actually we are not allowed to talk about certified forests because the accreditation guys and a few of the BCBs say we don't talk about a certified forest because we don't certify a forest, we only certify the management system that is controlling the forest management. So a small but important difference. That's the reason why it's defined here in this particular context in the standard. It's maybe of I would not say that publicly. I say that here in the webinar. It's maybe not that important for your daily business, but it's important as soon as we talk on a formal basis about the technical infrastructure of PEFC. So degraded forest as a next definition, it's a new definition. It's a definition in context with one of the conversion requirements, with the requirement dealing with the afforestation. Now, with the conversion of degraded forests to plantation, we recognized in the last years our PEFC has not been using such a definition in the 2010 version or in the previous standards. And we had some serious challenges in a few countries with that. And we decided to include a definition, being aware that any available definition of degraded forests has specific weaknesses. And the further we reduce these weaknesses, the more complex is the concept behind the definition and behind the understanding what's actually a degraded forest. So this FAO-based definition actually tries to use a few simple elements to describe that. I guess we will come back to that again when we are talking about conversion. So jumping to the forest definition, the forest definition changed in the standard. The forest definition in the previous version, PEFC, you see that used an FAO definition. We are now talking about the United Nations definition of forest, a definition that needs to be applied by the participants of the Paris Agreement in the expectation or with the expectation that this definition is closer to reality than the FAO definition. This forest definition was always a weak spot or a challenging spot for PEFC, since actually PEFC never strictly enforced to apply the FAO definition on the national or regional level. PEFC always accepted that the national law could overrule the FAO definition. In the long run, this will be very challenging, especially in context of the TOF implications. So that's the reason why the working group decided to go with a different definition that gives much more flexibility to national governing bodies, to particular countries. Forest conversion, an important element in the forest conversion definition, especially the node part here is important. This was object of long-going discussions in the working group. So to allow at least, or to move the focus of different tree species to other tree species in forest management without being considered as a conversion. In a few parts for a few of our members, this was a very essential element, and fortunately we had some very constructive discussions and some intensive collaboration of those areas to find a compromise so that we can handle this forest conversion definition quite strictly. So I will come to that later when I go through the conversion requirements. So with the current conversion requirements, I guess PEFC is still proceeded actually its strict position on conversions, and we already got some feedbacks that we are regarded, or that the PEFC requirements are regarded or perceived much better than a few elements of the FSC requirements. Coming back to that in a few minutes when we go to the conversion requirements. So now jumping to the last definition, the trees outside forest definition, actually as a counterpart of the forest definition, what's happening inside a forest, what's happening outside the forest, the TOF, actually, of course, the basis for the trees outside forest appendix. So now going to the further requirements. Under 4, a few specifications actually just for clarification of the interface between forest management and chain of custody. So far, or until today, PEFC has only requirements about this interface in the chain of custody standard, and it's actually not that logical or normal that a forest owner is aware of the requirements which are in the chain of custody standard, and actually more relevant for him than for the chain of custody company. So it was just a logic development to amend those general requirements in the SFM standard so that it's clarified how to handle any kind of claims to the first placer, to the first company in the chain of custody. So going to 6, compliance, legal compliance, that's an important amendment that's new, that's not covered in the today's standard. The standard requires that the organization shall identify and have access to the legislation applicable to its forest management and determine how these compliance obligations apply to the organization. We have at least one country that is already doing that since a few years. We have seen that. Maybe some of you remember, we shared that with the membership already, I guess, 2 years ago, and presented it as best practice. With this requirement, actually, PEFC is much closer and much more reliable, or much closer to a legal compliance audit or to a legal compliance understanding than today, where we actually just say, or where PEFC just says we comply with legislation, full stop. So that's going closer to the state of the art to say we do not just comply with legislation. We even know what legislation is relevant for us, and we know how this legislation is influencing SFM practices. Anti-corruption as one additional element. Also, I guess it's a kind of good practice to have this in a sustainability standard. So that was actually not a discussion in the working group whether to add that or not. Working hours in the social part, when you look at the headline, health, safety and working condition, working hours and leave shall comply with national laws or applicable collective agreements. And the next requirements with the wages for local and migrant forest workers, as well as of contractors and other operators. So that's an important element to strengthen the social aspect, the social side of the PEFC requirement. Equal employment opportunities, non-discrimination, freedom of workplace harassment, gender equality as further social aspects which are now formally anchored in the standard. So now already going to 8, the operations. Under 8, you still find the 6 criteria, the 6 Helsinki criteria as traditional structure for the PEFC requirements. So all the requirements which are not specifically in other management cycle areas of the standard are still together under this operations headline. In 8.1, actually, we had, and in context of PEFC strategy discussion that we had, lots of members highlighted the importance of considering climate change in PEFC's discussion. So we established a small task force, a very small task force in the group with a few, I guess we had 2 Nordics, one from the office, and 2 more members to find a few basic elements, what we can put into the standard. We clearly recognize that it's a difference between high-level discussions, what's important in a climate change discussion, and on the other hand, on the operational level, where we have forest owner representatives who are very careful with any kind of implications for their operational daily work. And those elements which are now in the standard are actually a kind of compromise. So this 813 is one. The other very important element is, and now I'm jumping a little bit further and going back in a minute, is the requirement under 816, where we are talking about severely degraded forests and the conditions under which a severely degraded forest can be converted to a plantation. So in the conversion discussion, we had we have now 3 requirements. Previously, or in the today's standard, you see that here in the right column, we have only the 5111, the conversion of forests to other types of land use, including conversion of primary forests to forest plantations. The working group wanted to go away from the term primary forest because that was in reality pretty challenging to implement. And instead of that, the ecologically important forest areas got a stronger meaning in the requirements, in the set of the requirements. So the 5% level is new under the B. In the current requirement, it's not explicitly written. However, it was the assessment benchmark that PEFC applied in the last years. So it's actually just making transparent what was used in reality, what has been used by PEFC since a long time. And here, of course, does not destroy areas of significantly high carbon stock as an additional requirement. So that's a requirement that's from the working group's perspective, a strengthening of the conversion requirement without establishing any hurdles which stop any specific desirable practice. So the working group clearly agreed on that. And I guess these three conversion requirements needed, of course, the biggest part of the discussion time in the development work. The 815 is an interesting bit. So that was actually not intended at the beginning, and during the conversion discussion, somebody raised the voice to say, hey, we should care also about ecologically important non-forest areas and not just plant trees everywhere. And so those requirements made their way into the standard concerning this afforestation disabler or challenge. Disabler is too strong, but a challenge under specific conditions. That gives us the advantage, for example, that with this requirement, we clearly meet in these basic requirements in the biomass discussion, where they are talking about non-forested peatlands, for example. So we can easily refer now to this new requirement. Another requirement is the 8.6. The 8.6 saying something or setting the scene for conversion of the severely degraded forests. There were very long discussions in the working group about giving more flexibility to the conversion requirement, specifically in context with the cutoff date. And this requirement is actually the outcome of the discussion. The working group decided not to touch the cutoff date. The working group decided not to make an exemption from the cutoff date in case of ownership change. That was intensively discussed, since FSC allows that, but the opinions, the perceptions are currently obviously changing. 2-3 years ago, even NGOs provided evidence that this rule is not misused. One of our NGOs representatives in the working group just asked us in a side discussion, how many evidences, how many examples do you want to get of this misuse? So there is obviously a change. So the working group decided not to touch this ownership. However, the degraded forest conversion is now possible under very specific conditions. And here again, the carbon stock plays an important role. And the working group decided to set a very high bar to enable that. That's specifically the bullet G, so that the entity who wants to convert a degraded forest need to provide a land history giving evidence that the degradation is not the consequence of deliberate poor forest management practices. That's a challenging element, but that's in the standard by intent, because the working group would have rather not included the requirement than opening an easy loophole. One basic condition or one basic elements why that the working group get a consensus was to say that the working group suggests to the PEFC board of directors to establish a permanent SFM working group after the revision process. And the first agenda item for this permanent working group shall be the further development of PEFC's position concerning conversions, especially conversions to plantations, with the objective sooner or later getting rid of the cutoff date. So in November, the board will decide on this, and with a high likelihood will appoint the secretariat to establish this standing working group. Another effect, and just as a simple example, we already got even from ENGOs interesting feedback on these carbon elements in this chapter 8.1, saying that these carbon management elements look much more pragmatic and effective than the FSC requirements. So we will see how this develop. So now going quickly through this further details, you still see, if you want to see that, you can, if you want to compare that in detail, you can check the text based on the bold letters. Going further down to 8.6, highlighting again the social elements. There is something that I didn't mention earlier. When you look at the 8.6.5, the equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of such knowledge, of the knowledge of indigenous people, traditional knowledge in some areas. So that's a further good element to have that in the standard. Chapter 9 and 10. In chapter 9, under monitoring, a few elements which are actually just moved to a different place in the standard from the existing standard, but also new elements concerning concerning internal audit and management review, and in 10, the improvement. So actually, those elements are coming from the ISO high-level structure. There were some discussions in the working group whether it's too prescriptive or not. Some of the members would have preferred to not to be that prescriptive. Some said yes, but we should be as close as possible to the ISO high-level language. So that's the outcome, that's the compromise, since even the critical working group members at the end of the process said, yes, we can live with it, we accept it, and we agree on a consensus. So that's something that how we will see how our NGBs implement that in the national standard. So now just going to the appendix 2, not to the plantations appendix. The plantations appendix actually didn't really change. It was just the requirements, and of course the interpretations were adjusted to the new standard, but without any specific elements to highlight. So just going to the TOF appendix. The TOF appendix, I already mentioned how it needs to be handled in general. So you have the main body of this appendix, the requirements repeated actually here in the left column, the interpretations for the TOF in the right column, and going through all the requirements, and having one additional requirements, actually requesting the good agricultural practices in the particular production system. The requirements potentially not applicable, and important is to say the potentially not applicable to trees outside forests based on a particular rationale. And in E, finally, the criteria how to differentiate the intensive and extensive TOF systems. Those criteria are important since the intensive TOF is covered more or less with the same requirements like the FM, and the extensive with the reduced number of requirements. The differentiation criteria are those 5, and that's something where during the assessment process, the assessor needs very clear evidence how these 5 criteria are used for differentiating the two production systems. So we are currently on the way to further develop the necessary procedures for the TOF standard, and we are maybe able to say a little bit more about that in 2 weeks' time during the PEFC week. So that's actually the content. These are the main changes in the SFM standard. The important question for you, how to handle the transition, maybe that's the important thing for the national governing bodies. There's a clear view from the board on that, saying that it needs to be switched, or the standard needs the national regional standards need to be switched in the next revision process, in the next review and revision process. So saying that it's actually a transition period of 3 years. It might happen that the board will ask the Secretariat to identify those countries who have maybe started for some reason in the last, just now recently, the revision process. So that could be an option, that for those countries being at the very beginning and of the process and still using the 2010 version, that for those countries the board might issue a specific request how to use the new requirements. But that's still something that the board will consider again in the November meeting, and we will say something more general assembly. So far, the content linked to the SFM standard, and now giving you the chance, in case that you have a few easy questions, of course, you can, if you prefer that, you can prepare now written questions that you can send us by email, and we can come back to those questions in the session at the members meeting, so that you maybe can first now digest all the explanations, or you have the chance now just to raise your questions immediately right now.
Yes, Mikhail. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Who's speaking, please? Can you say the name so that everybody knows who?
Natalia. It's Natalia, PEFC Russia. And so the question from Andrei Ryzhkov and Nikolai Prokazin.
Yeah.
We have a definition of a certified area, 3.3. And this definition specifies forest areas, actually, but it doesn't include TOF.
Yeah, that's actually covered by a wording, I guess, in the scope of the standard, where it's written that always that in the later text of the standard, when the standard is talking about forests and it correspondingly is relevant for the TOF as well, so the term forest covers also the TOF. That was a big discussion in the working group, how to do that, whether to specifically add these terms or delete the term forest. And the decision was, at least for the next years, the decision of the working group was to say we are talking mainly about the forests, and wherever relevant, this term, the particular definitions cover the TOF as well.
Well, thank you. Mikhail, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it is about the definition of forest. Standard in this version, so it says that the forest is the area of less than 500, and we think that it cannot be considered as forest. Besides, it also so social and ecological requirements cannot be applied to forest management on the area which is equal to
So now I lost you. Could you
Five.
please repeat what you said? You said you think forests of such a small area cannot be considered as a forest, but I didn't fully get your explanation.
100. I think that it cannot be considered as a forest, and it means that social and ecological requirements cannot be applied to forest management on such a small area, which is equal to 500. Besides, the standard also contradicts with the basic principles of sustainable forest management, and the definitions of forest and sustainable forest management are entirely distorted.
Yeah, it's actually I see that we have different views on this forest definition. This was intensively discussed in the working group, and since this is it's an internationally accepted definition of forest that can be applied in particular ways in different countries, and countries can to a certain extent modify the definition. The working group was just agreed to use that definition.
Yes, but in forest definition, you used a definition of 2002, but in existing version it is a definition of FAO 2005. So you returned to the later to the latest, so not latest but earlier version.
Yeah, we went to an early definition from the UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Forum for Carbon Change, for climate change. Since that's, this FAO definition internationally is challenged by lots of scientists and lots of institutions saying that the FAO definition is too far from real life in lots of countries. So this earlier definition gives us the chance to apply more flexibility so that Russia, Germany, Thailand, North America, different countries, different regions can handle this forest definition more flexible than with the previous definition.
Okay, thank you.
So, are there any other questions? Any other participants who want to ask something at that point? If not, I would proceed with the group certificate.
Mikhail, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's PEFC Russia again. Yeah. We have a couple of more questions. If it is possible, we can ask them later.
Yeah, how do you, so up to you to decide. We still can take 5 to 10 minutes for your question. You also can put these questions in an email if you prefer that, and we either come back to you by email or we raise the questions at the PEFC week. It's up to you to decide that. Maybe it's easier if you put them in an email and send it to us.
Oh, okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, if there is no further question, I will jump to the group certification standard. Again, highlighting if you have any concerns, any need for clarification in the next 2 weeks, don't hesitate to take your email, send us your questions so that we can be at least prepared if we don't come back earlier, but so we can be prepared at the members only session to give you a good answer for that. So going to the group certification standard, the basic changes, new elements in the group certification standard. So as you have seen, I guess, as well, the ISO high-level structure used in the group certification standard. In the group certification context, it's even more important than in the SFM standard. We explained that a few times in the different events, webinars in the last months, that we had a specific challenge in this group certification standard. We got a very clear indication. We had some strong concerns of accreditation bodies in several countries saying that they will stop their accreditation program for group certification if PEFC would not significantly strengthen the group certification requirements. Group certification requirements in terms of strengthening the management system approach, so providing evidence that these groups are able to manage and influence the development in this particular region, in the area that is under the scope of the certificate. So as a consequence of that, we tried to get somebody, and that worked, from IAF in this working group that was responsible for the revision. We had an official IAF liaison person. It was represented, it was a person from the German accreditation body, and we had another representative from the Swedish accreditation body. And the main discussions in this working group were around formal issues between PEFC and IAF. So one way to come closer to their expectations actually was to use the high-level structure, the management system approach, to make it very clear that PEFC is considering this group as a management system standard, the group certification requirements as a management system standard. Just to give you an example, what a few accreditation bodies are requesting. So they said they are saying actually sampling in internal or even external audits, especially in internal audits, is not possible. We would need to apply an approach that gathers, that provides strong data about all activities of each member in a group. So on the operational level, the largest PEFC certification group in forest management is in Germany, in Bavaria. In Bavaria, the Bavarian group has about 100,000 participants. So that would strictly mean that this Bavarian group needs a database and a management system actually giving an exact overview about all annual activities of each of the 100,000 participants. So I guess it's clear for everybody that that's a way forward. That's not possible. PEFC group certification, as it's traditionally done, would be dead on this basis. So we try to work on a compromise, and the current standard actually was approved on a consensus basis in the working group. However, the IAF liaison abstained, but that's for further technical reasons, since even the official liaison person cannot speak for all IAF accreditation bodies. That's only possible in the IAF technical committee. So difficult explanations, long story, short result. We got a standard as a result that it's quite acceptable. However, we already have one accreditation body, fortunately, in a country with very few groups, or with more or less just one group, that says no PEFC certification anymore with sampling. And we are still working on that to get a formal IAF confirmation. So long story, important new element, the ISO HLS structure. I guess you've seen the same thing concerning the language. It's also this benchmark language the standard requires. The other element, strengthening the management system. You see a few requirements in the documents, strengthening the responsibilities, strengthening, for example, the aspect with the new members. I will come to that in detail. And the most important amendment, the most important new development, of course, is the framework for the internal audit based on sampling. So that's for the first time that PEFC defines in a standard a framework for the sampling. Important to understand that in the working group or concerning acceptance of that, we actually had all major countries with the very large FM groups in the working group. So we had Austria, we had the US, we had Finland, we had Sweden, we had Germany, we had Spain. So all countries with lots of large groups were represented, and that was pretty important. So to be able to say that this sampling approach, this internal audit approach, is actually acceptable for the countries. The feedback that we already got, or what we heard, or what we discussed in the working group, was that it actually depends, or the additional effort coming from this internal audit and sampling rules depends on the country. For some countries, they are already today with the existing standard more or less in 100% compliance. In other countries, they are in full compliance with it. They just do not document it, and the requirement now requests to make it transparent and to have it available so that it's visible for everybody, that it can be communicated. And a few other countries maybe have to adjust their sampling procedure. So we have a little bit of everything in that. You see the four main elements of this sampling process, and I don't go into the very final detail later when I jump to the standard. We have actually four major steps. That's the determination of the sample size based on all participants in a group, the determination of sample categories within a group. That means if we have a very large group with very different forest management conditions, for example, high mountains in the south and very flat parts of the country in the north, so very different procedures, very different risk elements, we request to determine specific sample categories. There's a third step then saying how the sample size, that means the number of the sample, shall be distributed to the categories. And finally, a simple requirement concerning the selection of the participants. So those four elements build the framework for this internal audit process, for the sampling process. Of course, for the audit process, there is much more necessary. So going from that to the standard, and as I said at the beginning, we don't have such a full reference table between the old and the new standard. What we can provide is this version of the standard. In this version, you see a few highlights with colors. The green color refers to new elements, the yellow to modified elements, and and there's later another one just to highlight an example in blue. Not saying that it's in this document 100% described, but you can use it at least as an orientation. One important thing when you read the standard, it's actually you will see lots of elements which are coming from the ISO high-level structure language. And we had some discussions about that in the working group, where we decided at the end of the day that it's easier to train the PEFC representatives who are responsible for the development of the standard in using the new standard and using this language, then explaining it permanently and again and again and again to our accreditation bodies and certification bodies. So therefore, the language might be sometimes perceived as pretty strange from a forest arena perspective, but it's actually standardization language that is internationally used and that PEFC should be able to use as well. So in the definitions, I don't go to all of the definitions. In the definitions, you find a few new ones, like the audit or the documented information. Those are definitions coming from ISO and actually more or less copy paste from ISO. There is one bit that is important to understand under participant. You see participant as yellow. Yellow means we had the definition in previous versions. It was just modified. And here we specifically modified, we amended the note. The background of this change is that we identified, unfortunately, in a very late state of the standard development, that in a few PEFC countries, we have groups, for example, with forest contractors as member of this group. And that's actually challenging if we would have read the existing standard in a literal way. And the working group decided to try to find in a very late stage, that means more or less in the last meeting in March after the consultation and in a conference call in September this year, to establish a pragmatic requirement how to enable that, how to clearly anchor that in the standard. And this note now makes sure it explains what needs to be done in case that a country allows the membership of such contractors or purchasing companies, procurement companies, to make sure that those companies make only claims on material that they sell if it's guaranteed that it comes from PEFC certified forests. So that's actually anchored in the note in the definition of this participant. Stakeholder, affected stakeholder, it's the same like in the SFM standard. Policy, a new term, it's an ISO term, as you can consider it as basic objectives of an organization relevant in a policy statement. So then saying explicitly highlighting, I already mentioned it earlier, that it can be decided whether some of the SFM requirements are implemented on individual level or some of the requirements are implemented on the group level. Implicitly, lots of countries have already done that in the last years. So a simple example where we had long discussions a few years ago in one of the countries, where the communication process, the requested process to communicate with stakeholders, with affected stakeholders, was implemented on the group level. Where we had a discussion whether that's possible or if it's necessary to do that on the individual level. And at that stage, there was a clear interpretation or a clear statement backed up by the PEFC board that if, of course, a group management system is able to handle that, then such individual requirements can be moved one level up and can be considered on group level. That's actually something that really makes sense, or that's one of the basic elements of such a real group certification in forestry. However, the group system must be able to control the particular requirement. I give you another example for that, a simple example. I already mentioned this Bavarian group, 100,000 participants, and I'm not totally sure how many hectares. I guess it's about 1 million in Bavaria in this group. So theoretically, this group or an individual participant can spend some thoughts on the 5% conversion of a forest type requirement. And of course, it's a significant difference whether you consider this 5% on the level of an individual participant who has maybe 0.5 hectares or 2 hectares under his management, or if you go to the group level with 1 million hectare, that as an outcome could mean that 5,000 smallholders actually do 100% clear cut of their area. So what we say now, what the standard says now, is that of course this 5% can be considered on group level, but if the group considers it and complies with that on group level, the management system of the group must be able to control that. So that means the group entity in Bavaria would need a tool to make sure that they don't go above this 5% on group level. Pretty challenging for 100,000 participants. I don't think that it's realistic, but for other indicators, they are already doing that. So it depends a little bit. So coming to responsibilities, we have lots of similar issues like the identical issues which are already in the 2010 version. There are a few new elements. So for example, to establish written procedures for the acceptance of new participants. These procedures shall cover at least the verification of the applicant's information about contact details, clear identification of the forest property, and their size or sizes. So I guess I don't need to comment that anymore. Most of you will be aware of the cash investigation issue in France. So that's one of the reasons why this requirement was amended and put into the standard. Another new element, when you go to the next bullet point, group participants excluded from any certification group based on non-conformities cannot be accepted within 12 months after exclusion. It was a long discussion in the group whether to put something like that in, and at the end we had a clear decision on that. So to operate an annual internal audit program as a new requirement that is not in the today's standard. And of course, we still have these two elements, and they are under the responsibility of the participant as well as under the responsibility of the group entity in a different wording, but it was already in the existing standard here saying to inform the group entity about non-conformities identified under other PEFC certifications than the particular group certification. That was since 2010 one of the most difficult requirements in the assessments with a significant number of non-conformities, but the non-conformities based off a misunderstanding and not understanding of the requirement. That actually says this requirement and the corresponding one under 511, that if a forest owner is a member in 2 or more PEFC groups, we have countries where this can happen. If a forest owner is a member in 2 or more groups, and if there is a non-conformity in one of the groups, the other group need to be aware of that. So that's a challenging issue since it's actually a cross-group information flow, but the entity and the participant have to make sure that it happens. In some countries, it might be not an issue. In all countries where you have only geographical groups, actually it's excluded by default. In other countries where you have a combination of both or groups without regional boundaries, it can happen. So here in 6 under planning, you see then a corresponding requirement concerning the management system when you decide to fulfill a specific requirement on the group level. You see here the requirement that it needs to be integrated in the planning process of the group. Necessary competence, that's also something new, that it shall be defined by the standard what's the competence of the person that is doing some work in the group. That was an important requirement also coming from the accreditation bodies in management systems, defining the competence of the involved people. A complaint procedure process for resolving complaints and disputes, also new in that way in the standard. Performance evaluation, that's finally now this internal audit bit. It's yellow because a few elements, or we already had the requirement for a monitoring program. Now it's also the internal audit. And here you see first the organization part, how to organize an internal audit, and then what I already have shown you, the 4 steps how to select the participants in this internal audit program. I don't go to the detail, just to say it very simple. There is a basic, very simple formula. You take the participants in one group, not the area, not the number of sites. You take the number of participants, you take the square root, and then you get a particular number, you get a number of indicators based on which you can adjust this result of the square root. So I have highlighted 2 new requirements which are not in the today's standard. So if a group, for example, applies specific technologies for information gathering, they can maybe adjust this sample. A simple example, we are currently starting a collaboration fund project in Spain with the objective to develop procedures of using remote sensing data to support this sampling procedure. If a country is using remote sensing information to better specify the sample, it could be an option to reduce the number of the sampling. Or we have another example, I guess it's Sweden, that is already using that since a long time. They are doing each year a survey. Sorry, I just had some noise on the phone, and I would like to ask you to mute yourself in case you haven't done that. So coming back to that, to the example of Sweden, they are doing a survey, an annual survey with the members of a group, asking for specific activities in the year, and based on the responses of this survey, they decide how they organize the sampling. So that's another option, how to influence the size of the sample. The second step is the development of the determination of sample categories. I already mentioned that it more or less a risk-based approach to decide whether a group should establish different risk categories. So if you have different conditions concerning ownership, concerning size of management, biogeographic regions, and a few other criteria, you can say you establish different categories, and then you distribute based on this risk assessment, you distribute your sample to this category. So a simple example, I guess it's only partially true, but to make it real, a very large group having one very large member, this and one very large and 99 very, very small. And this large group has a very this large member has a very sophisticated management system, and where you can be quite sure that good management practices are used in a large area of the group, and you don't have a real clue what the 99 are doing. So you can say, okay, of course, we have 2 different risk classes. We have one, the very large one with a low risk, because we know how the group, how it works, how the member works, and we don't need to see that much of this unit of this member, and you don't have any information about the 99 other members. So you say, okay, we put the main resources of our internal audit in the 99 small, just as a very simple example, and not saying that it's real or something else. Selection of the participants, finally, risk-based procedure, the sample, the random element as well. And management review and the improvement requirements, more or less almost the same language like in the SFM standard. So that's another, from the working group, from both working groups' perspectives, an advantage that the language is so close to each other, in the two standards, that the standards talk in a good way to each other and are closely linked. That's the overview about the group certification standard. And now, in the same way like the SFM, I would give you the chance for a few quick questions if you maybe have some easy questions. And again, the same for the group certification standard. You can put your questions in an email. You can send questions to us, and we will be prepared at the latest during the PFC week to come back to those questions in the members only session on the Tuesday. So the floor is yours. Any questions on the group certification? I don't hear any questions. So again, if you will wake up tomorrow morning and your mind is full with unsolved issues and you just got the idea that there are lots of things which need clarification, don't hesitate to contact us, ask us, send us emails, call us, discuss with us in the PFC week.
Mikhail?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's again PFC Russia. Can I ask a question about SFM standard, not group
Yeah, so if we don't
possible to do it?
If there is no question, if nobody else raises the voice concerning group, and I don't hear anything, yes, then please ask, come back to the SFM and ask the SFM question.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the question is, if the SFM standard is approved, so can we consider TOF requirements as inapplicable in our country, I mean Russian Federation, due to the fact that in our country forest management is subject to forest laws, like for example forest code, and TOF it's quite another area, separate area, which is covered by other legislation like land codes and so civil codes and so on. So my question is, can we consider TOF requirement inapplicable?
That's the decision of PFC Russia. So you can, if PFC Russia decides not to consider trees outside forest areas for certification, then it's only your decision and PFC will not challenge this decision. If PFC Russia decides that PFC Russia wants to certify trees which are outside the forest, then independent of the legislation, you have to develop those requirements. But of course, it's the decision of each national governing body to say, we don't want to consider trees outside forests. That's only your decision.
Okay, thank you for your answer. It was very important for us to hear it and to have a clear vision of how to apply the approved standard, forest management standard locally.
Yeah, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
this question. You know, that's very important that we highlight that and that we make it clear to everybody that this appendix is a voluntary module. It's a kind of voluntary module. National governing bodies can decide to use it and they can decide not to use it. Okay, so thank you very much for your attendance this late afternoon, at least in Europe in the late afternoon. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you very much for your questions. I look very much forward to meeting you in 2 weeks here in Geneva, and hopefully we have further interesting discussions about that. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Have a good day. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.